We're now going to move to Leisha Aodha de Bruyne. Leisha is from Ireland. She's the founder and spokesperson of the Countess Didn't Fight for This. You commissioned an independent survey into attitudes about gender in Ireland. What's been happening with the Countess Didn't Fight for This, etc.?
We are sort of going through a period, well, I am, of kind of assessing what we've achieved so far in the last 10 months. We're only 10 months launched. So I thought I could talk you through what we've been doing and what we intend to do and our various campaigns and work behind the scenes. So firstly, who are we? I'll come to that in a moment. So this is who we are. We're a group of progressive women from all walks of life, students, stay-at-home mothers, doctors and lawyers. We're fully self-funded, we're volunteer-led, we're not affiliated to any party or religion, and we've members all over Ireland. We are part of a growing group of grassroots groups globally who are resisting trans activism and calling out the impact on women and children. We represent a growing constituency of people in Ireland who are really waking up to the impact of what could loosely be called inclusivity, and the impact of those measures and policies on women and children. As the time has passed over the last 10 months, I would say that I have become more nuanced in my messaging. So now we're not here to change anyone's beliefs around transgender identity. We're simply here calling for a wider lens in terms of examining the impact of these laws and policy in Ireland. I would say that's particular to, exactly where we are in Ireland. We have, it's fair to say that we are really the poster child of self-ID. One of the first countries to bring it in. We're English speaking, we're seen as a nice little friendly country, and definitely we're touted around the world as a country where it's bedded down without any problems. However, over the course of the 10 months, we've kind of had a three-prong approach. One is to public service, really, to actually just educate people about what the law actually does and the impact on women and children, and to raise consciousness and awareness, and to try to shift the narrative, because thus far the narrative, before we launched, the narrative was very much about there's nothing to see here, trans rights are women's rights, trans rights are human rights, and this is part of the great kind of progressive consensus that we now live with in Ireland. So over the last 10 months, we've had three major sort of campaigns. The first one was called We Will Be Heard. And this was our response to a letter that was signed by 27 different NGOs, including Amnesty, but also the National Women's Council of Ireland, calling for new groups. So that was particular to us, to be disenfranchised. So we ran a campaign online, and it kind of caught a wave, really, and it trended globally in the UK and the US, as well as obviously at home in Ireland. And I think that was our first sort of consciousness raising in terms of women being, women like us being repressed. And then after that, we ran our first ever real life campaign nationally. Now it looked like, we suddenly kind of broke the media monolith and started getting some media traction. But I have to say, behind the scenes, this was after 6 months of hard slog of sending out press release after press release after press release. And I think what happened with that, so that was basically a story whereby it was the day that gender identity ideology came home in Ireland and came to kind of the doorstep of families in Ireland, across Ireland, because and to this day I'm still shocked at what happened, really. So we were there campaigning and raising awareness and lobbying around the fact that if the advice from the trans lobby groups was adhered to in schools, adolescent boys who identified as girls would be allowed to use the girls' toilets. And so therefore the girls would lose their single sex spaces. And that was our concern. Little did we ever think that the Department of Education in Ireland would actually completely pull the rug from under those girls by attempting to remove all single-sex toilets across all secondary schools in Ireland. And to this day, I find that as a real extreme example of how captured the public sector is in Ireland, that we are at this point whereby it is seen as a rational response to so-called bullying, and that it's a normal thing to do to actually remove single-sex toilets from secondary schools. So we launched a campaign around that and made the mainstream media the front page of the paper of record. And then we scrambled and put together a toolkit which was used to sort of put the Department of Education on notice, but also, and this is the important thing, parents have a lot of rights in Ireland. They're enshrined in our constitution, and they're part of the 1998 Education Act, and parents really can kick up a fuss about their local school their children go to. So we've seen that as a very important angle for us in terms of campaigning. And there was a backtrack, but I don't think it's, I think they are still trying to push this through. And then the most recent thing we did was as an historic poll, the first ever poll of its kind in Ireland. We worked with a household name called Red Sea. And I would say to any activists out there who are considering doing a poll, we were aware that there is a lot of capture in Ireland, but the thing about capture is people aren't aware that they are captured. So I would say, it's fair to say it was a very long, complicated, torturous process. And you'll see when I come to the poll, I'll just share my screen now, that, we have a very strict social media policy in terms of language. For instance, we don't use the word trans woman, but when it came to this poll, compromises had to be made. I felt personally it was more important to get it over the line. And in fact, the process was so tricky that by 2 o'clock Monday, it almost collapsed. The whole thing almost collapsed due to disagreements about language and about how to kind of analyze it. But we got there, and this data is here now. And lo and behold, like every other poll that's been done in the US and the UK, it turns out that the majority of people agree with us, that our position is not in fact, radical or fringe, that actually the majority of people who hold an opinion about these issues agree with us. So these are the top lines. You can see figures are very strong here. Now, we felt it was very important to ask questions beyond just the conflict of rights between women's protections under the law and trans demands, trans activism. And we went deeper than that. So this one, for instance, it's nothing specifically to do with self-ID, it's broader, because in Ireland we do have a policy of mixed sex wards. So here we see 64% actually think that hospitals should be required to have single-sex wards. 77% say that you should be allowed to demand someone of the same natal sex as you for an intimate examination. And this one is interesting. So when I wrote the poll script, I really wanted to offer a choice of a third space, because that's what we would advocate for, but obviously we don't spend our time campaigning for that. There are plenty of well-funded trans lobby groups who can do that should they wish to. But the polling company didn't want us to offer a third space as alongside single sex. And I really resisted that because I felt that was forcing people to make a binary choice, and people don't necessarily want to, but they said it was exclusionary to talk about a third space. So I said, okay, fine. Now, as you can see, even within that context, it still came out quite strong in favor of single sex spaces. So in fact, the question was, should public buildings, for example, banks and schools, should they have to provide single sex toilets or mixed sex? And 62% say single sex. So it's fair to say the Irish public are very, very much in favor of all our positions, which we knew anecdotally, but it's very, I think it's very powerful to see it in print, and I think it will have huge leverage for us politically in terms of our lobbying work. Now, this is very interesting. This is the question about self-ID. As you can see, we don't mention the Gender Recognition Act. We don't really even talk about self-ID, because my objective with this was to get past jargon and dig deeper than what people think one means when one says things like a transgender woman, or, you know, because quite often I think people are confusing social expression and presentation with actual rights, laws, and access to spaces. So, as you can see here, the question was, at what point, it's tiny, sorry, I'll read it out. At what point, if at all, should a person who identifies as a member of the opposite sex be allowed to change their sex on the birth cert? And this really goes to the heart of the whole issue. I met Robert Wimboot recently, who is one of the signatories of the Jogga Principles, and he is the one who's recanted publicly. And he said, you know, once we started to falsify public documents, public records of birth to assuage mental illness, that's where we went wrong. That was when the genie was let out of the bottle, and I tend to agree. And as you can see, so does a huge cohort of the Irish population. So 28% say that people should never be allowed to change their sex in the birth cert. And 26% say only once they've had genital surgery. So that is a really, really strong figure. And only 17%, so less than 1 in 5 people in Ireland think that the law as it stands, that they agree with the law as it stands, which is what we have, which is you fill out a form once you know, to say that you identify as the opposite sex. So we were very, very happy with the findings. We also, so we did a very, very broad poll. We kind of asked all the key questions. It's sort of like taking the temperature, you know, of the nation. Changing rooms. Of those who had expressed an opinion, almost twice as many said trans identified males should not have access to female spaces. We were really happy with that. We feel this will be a good ballast against what is happening down the line in Ireland, which I'll come to in a moment. But our government is attempting to amend our equality legislation to include gender identity as a ground. So this is really good data, I think, in terms of what the public feel about that. Sport, as we all know, is the one that people seem to care really deeply about. Really, really, really strong figures there. Again, more than twice as many think that you should not be allowed to play sport of the opposite sex, that men should not be able to play female sport. Now, these two are a little bit more nuanced, and I do think that's because, sadly, the women in refuges and in prisons are so othered that people don't relate their plight to their own lives, whereas with sport and with changing rooms, they do. But we were really, really happy with the result. You know, it felt like a great day. It felt like we were adding a kind of key data set really to the debate globally as well. And it's nice to be able to say, you know, actually, we're not the poster child of self-ID. Actually, Irish people do not agree with any of this. So that was the poll. Now, unfortunately, only one journalist was brave enough to cover that for us. We sent it to every newsroom in Ireland, and only one journalist covered it. And, you know, I have to say, we know, I mean, I'm a journalist and a few of us are journalists, and we know it has news value. We understand its news value. And so it was quite chilling. It was quite chilling to feel that journalists were reading this press release and going, no, it's untouchable. We can't cover it. One journalist did for the Sunday Times, and we're very, very grateful to Brenda Power, but and there has been some other coverage. But so that was the poll. We do think, like, you know, the thing is, the way I look at it is the data is there now, and it will help us lobby behind the scenes with politicians, because they can't say that they don't know what the people feel about any of gender identity ideology. In terms of what else we've been doing, so that's all the sort of shop front, you know, the campaign, the content, the work that you can see. But we've also been doing lots of submissions. We were signatories to the Wolf submission to the UN. We did a submission to the EU. We're currently doing one to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. There's a big one coming up for us, which I just alluded to there. So in Ireland, we have self-ID, which there's no gatekeeping. There's no state oversight of who gets to fill out the form and get the gender recognition certificate. However, I see us very much at a cliff edge because we are about to now. So there is a move to include gender identity as a grounds, and how I see this working is that once gender identity, once our equality legislation is amended to include gender identity, I see this as the criminalization of the defense of female spaces against male incursion. So were I in a changing room with my daughters and a man walks in, I can't stop him. If I stop him, that is discriminatory on my part. And indeed, if I complain to the owner of the swimming pool, they're also discriminating. And that's what we're seeing playing out around the world, like in We Spa and various places. Now, this is going to be an open submission. So we formed a working group, and we will start putting together our own submission, but also a template, because I see our role as, I don't want to just help people who are already articulate and empowered and aware of structure and politicized. Obviously they are part of our family, but I want to help. I think we should be empowering people who don't feel like they have the vocabulary, don't feel like they don't feel confident enough to write that letter to their public representative or their local school or to their paper. So that's what we're trying to do at this phase of kind of our evolution. Also, we will be, I'm speaking at the Filia conference in October, which I'm delighted and honoured to be speaking about. I'll be speaking about the specific kind of cultural and historical landscape in Ireland with regard to our work. And the other thing, so I've talked about all our behind the scenes work, our submissions. I wanted to pick up on what one of the speakers said, which really struck me. The woman speaking from Uganda, she said, feminism in Uganda is seen as hating men or being against men or masculinity. And it struck me that, recently I've had conversations with women who I really respect and admire and who are highly educated women who have said to me, one of them said, I just think it's all about, saying that all men are bad and hating men. And what I've noticed is that there's in Irish culture, people are very uncomfortable to talk about structure, to talk about male pattern violence, to talk about the fact that one sex class rapes and murders the other. There's a real tendency to not want to look at the darkness. And I think that is probably global, but and I think that's why liberal feminism is so compelling, because you don't have to then look at those things. However, I think our challenge in terms of our campaigning is you have to understand structure. That is the theoretical framework of our argument, of the resistance, because trans women or women is only damaging to women if you understand structural inequality. So I think that's our challenge, to try to explain why to explain our position to people who don't necessarily want to look at structure. So what I've tried to do and tended to do, sometimes by default, we've tried to really narrow our scope and talk about, loopholes, unintended consequences, well-meaning but badly thought through legislation. Furthermore, we write to regulatory bodies and statutory bodies, and we remind them of their responsibilities, and we ask them, do they have a policy? Have they done a risk assessment? And I think, it's a slog, but bit by bit, that will have an impact. So it's kind of about finding different angles. Like we have a working group called Follow the Money, which is led by an accountant. And, you know, we've made great inroads there recently, just simply by actually writing to all the different regulatory bodies that look at corporate governance, that look at the spending of public funds. You know, the biggest trans lobby group in Ireland have been late with their filing of their accounts on a number of occasions. And we were just watching and then just pushing on that pressure point. You know, it's not a big, glamorous, sexy campaign, but it is very, very useful because it's just another pressure point. And I think also it brings people in. So, you know, it brings the people in who don't really want to get involved in the debate, who don't care really about women's rights and child safeguarding. And sadly, that is a big swathe of the population, but they might care about where taxpayers' money is going. So there's all these different angles that we try to look at and bring people in. And that's also why I think, you know, I don't say that we're a feminist organization for that reason, because I want people who don't perceive themselves as feminists to agree with our positions. So, for example, I've had people say, I'm not a feminist, it's just not fair though. It's just not fair. And I think that's good, because those people are then, you're bringing in a wider base and you're looking at this, we're looking at this from a kind of very broad spectrum. But obviously, unconsciously, then you are raising awareness and consciousness, but it's kind of under the surface. So we've just recently joined an international working group on prisons, which I feel is really important. I think that's how we are going to overcome this ideology, is by joining up globally. In terms of what's happening on the ground, we only learned actually a few days ago, it was confirmed to us that the 3 trans-identified males in female prison in Ireland are actually in isolation 23 hours a day. We had heard rumours about this, but we knew they were segregated, but not specifically isolated according to the Mandela rules. So I think that is going to be a ticking time bomb, frankly, because that is obviously, it's a breach of those rules after 15 or 16 days. So with that in mind, the prison services now, they've set upon a consultation with stakeholders. So our objective will be at that table. What we will need to show them is that whilst we appreciate the attempts to keep women safe within the women's state by keeping those men in their prison cells, obviously it's not feasible long term. And that's why there is going to be a consultation. Like we know, for example, when they leave their prison cell, they always have a male and female guard with them. That's the protocol that's in place. So we see no reason why that protocol couldn't be in place in a male prison. It is actually used for gang leaders, and if there's feuds or if people are, if there's likely to be violence, that is actually typically employed. So there's no reason why that same protocol can't be used to keep trans-identified males safe within the male estate.